Thank you for that, Geraint. I would like to repeat Geraint's welcome to everybody, say thank you for coming along. It's fantastic to see so many people here supporting what will hopefully be an interesting and stimulating day. We are delighted to have Guy Howard, our first speaker here today. Guy is a groundwater scientist, but currently heads up the WASH policy team in the Department for International Development. So Guy is hopefully going to be giving us a bit of a donor perspective on the importance of groundwater monitoring, management and mapping for sustainable groundwater development. Thank you, Guy.
Okay, thanks, Kirsty. Just bear with me a minute. Coming down from Scotland, I'm not used to having air conditioning, so it regularly prompts coughing. I mentioned that to my colleagues down here yesterday. They did point out that we have windows up in Scotland, which also helps greatly. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm really welcome this conference. What I'm going to do today is not give you any kind of technical discussion about the role of groundwater in WASH. I'm assuming that most of you know that already, or if you don't, there will be plenty of other speakers who will go into more of the technical detail. What I'm going to try and do is to try and give a sense of how, within the Department for International Development, we try to integrate groundwater within our thinking around WASH and water resource programming, to give you a sense of how we address this issue. As Kirsty said, I do have a background in groundwater, although as has been pointed out to me in the past, I'm not strictly a hydrogeologist, so I tend to refer to myself more as a groundwater person. I also have spent a large part of my career looking at water and sanitation. My substantive role is as the lead of the policy team on water, sanitation and hygiene in DFID, which includes managing some very large global delivery programs. Although actually at the moment I'm not doing that. I'm actually doing a different job. I'm a deputy director in our research and evidence division, but that's only for the next 5 months, and then I'll be back to the world of WASH. Just before I start this, one of the things I noticed on Geraint's slide was, an objective to get every large-scale water supply program to have a groundwater assessment or environmental impact assessment done. And let me just pick up on that specifically. In DFID, all our projects have to have a climate and environment assessment done before they're approved. It's a mandatory requirement. It's true to say it probably varies the depth to which we go into groundwater issues. Certainly when I do climate and environment assessments, because that's part of my professional accreditation within DFID, quite a lot of time is spent on looking at what the groundwater implications will be and pushing programs to be serious about thinking around issues about groundwater management, groundwater monitoring, about groundwater quality and about pollution risk prevention. Whether it's always successful or not is a slightly different question. Easier when I'm managing the overall program, because I can just tell myself what to do, and that tends to work. Not always. Okay, so just a quick summary from a DFID perspective. Well, why do we think groundwater is important? Well, I think across DFID there is a wide acceptance that actually understanding groundwater is going to be critical if we want to have effective WASH and effective water resource programs. And we have a significant list of past failures where we didn't do this very well. So I've listed a couple of theirs. For instance, in Darfur, where in the immediate response to get water into camps, people didn't do groundwater assessments, and that led to longer-term problems around overexploitation, conflict over a limited resource, and then having to retrofit a program of integrated water resource management. And our experience throughout large parts of South Asian megadeltas, where in the past programs didn't always test for all the parameters that perhaps they should have done. And even now, I'm surprised that even now I quite often still have to pick up on things about saying, well, actually, if you're going to do a groundwater-based water supply program in the Asian megadeltas, you really do need to factor in the testing for arsenic in that. It's not to say you'll find arsenic everywhere, but you need to at least go and do it. It's due diligence. I think also the other reason where this comes in about it being important is around climate change and the future challenge that climate change poses for development, which are really very profound. I mean, there are really very profound implications about what will happen and how you secure a sustainable development for people. But there's a lot unknown around that. We need to understand what changes in precipitation will ultimately mean in terms of groundwater recharge, and that is not a simple question, and there is not a simple answer to it. You know, the implications of that will vary by region. The implications of that will probably vary in one region over time as well. And we need to do much more about linking the hydrogeological, the hydrological, and the climate communities together. There is an assumption throughout much of the world that certainly rural livelihoods, groundwater is the buffer for climate change. Groundwater will get everybody out of the problem. Very nice in theory. Unfortunately, given that people don't understand what the groundwater base is like and resources like in most of those places, it's an assumption that is very deeply flawed and has some very serious long-term risks. And there are issues with flooding and groundwater flooding as its contribution to wider flooding and integrated flood risk management that is increasingly also beginning to be thought about. Oh, I've got to remember to do that bit. Okay, so this is just a summary of things I think you would all need to know, would recognise. But the way that we approach this is trying to push programs to make sure that we understand a groundwater base before we start a project, so that we actually are putting in place water supplies that we think actually do have some hope of being sustainable over at least the medium term. Increasingly trying to focus about building up systems for ongoing monitoring after projects are completed, so that we don't just put in a project, claim a result, walk away, but we're actually trying to put in place systems where people are repeatedly going back and checking what the groundwater resource is like. And increasingly trying to invest around the mapping of those resources to build a broader sense and understanding of what the groundwater resources are like and what the groundwater development options will be. But, important caveat at the end, in DFID, as in virtually all donor organisations, groundwater specific can still be quite a difficult political sell. It's not highest. It's much easier to talk about taps and toilets than it is to talk about groundwater resource mapping. We are at least in a better position than we have been with some previous ministers whose names I won't mention, but who consistently said, look, I just don't get all this water resource and your groundwater work. I mean, what's this all about? And no matter how many times we explained that, we were still left with the same answer. I think the current set of ministers do understand it much more, but it's not a political, obvious, easy sell in the way that other things can be. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is try and give you a flavour of some of the things that we're doing about linking groundwater to WASH programmes. And to set that in context, within the water sector, we essentially, I suppose, manage three broad categories of programmes. We have direct water and sanitation and hygiene programmes, mainly through our country offices. So we have programmes in about 17 different countries where the funding is bilateral. We also now have two large centrally managed programmes that are managed by my team. I think it would be fair to say that the focus of most of those programmes is not water, it is much more on sanitation and hygiene. And that reflects really where we are in terms of progress against the MDGs. And we won't have this discussion today, but there's a wider, more philosophical point about whether the MDGs set targets appropriately, and actually if you use the same level of service for water supply that you do for sanitation, we are actually probably even further off track on water than we are on sanitation. But I'll leave that for another day to have that particular discussion. We also fund water resources work, which are broader work about trying to support countries and regions improve water resource management. A lot of that's through our country offices, through climate change funding, but we also have major regional initiatives in South Asia, through the South Asia Water Governance Programme, and programmes in Africa. So that includes the Nile Basin Initiative, but it also includes the Southern Africa Transboundary River project, and also a continental-wide programme looking at shared waters in Africa. And finally, we actually fund quite a bit of research on water, and it's increasing again. We had a bit of a gap for a while, but increasingly there's investments in research, including specific groundwater programs. So how do we try and build some consideration of groundwater into the new WASH programs? So these are a first couple of examples about how we are specifically trying to do this with our two new global programs, one of which is a strategic partnership with UNICEF, which is covering 9 countries, trying to reach about 5 million people. And the second is a WASH results program that has funded 3 consortiums, 2 of which are a mix of NGOs and private companies, and one which is just an NGO-led program, which is covering 13 countries and trying to reach about 4.7 million people. So within both of these programs, an explicit requirement from the terms of reference stage and all the way through the contracting phase and the MOU phase is a requirement that the suppliers demonstrate that they have properly addressed environmental assessment, which means that, for instance, on the WASH results program, we ask consortiums specifically to outline to us the proposed ways in which they would assess the water resources that they were intending to use for water supplies. So not just saying we will do it, but giving us detail on the methodologies that they would propose to use. And that we explicit requirement that they factored into that, trying to take some consideration of future climate changes and what future climate changes might occur in the regions in which they propose to work. And that, particularly with sanitation investments, they were also outlining how that they would assess the risk of pollution, specifically to groundwater, as most of the sanitation programs we fund will be on-site sanitation. More importantly, these are things that these people are being expected to actually report to us on on a regular basis, and for getting our agreement that we accept what they've done is done correctly. With UNICEF, we're also having an ongoing dialogue with them about how they actually build on some of their climate change water resource work and try and develop a more sophisticated system in which they can build up a greater confidence in what they're doing in terms of getting sustainable water supplies. I think what's critical with both of these programs is both of these programs are subject to a separate, independent monitoring, evaluation and verification program. So we have 2 contracts with 2 providers who are specifically asked to go and monitor these programs, check results. In the case of the WASH results program, that is specifically tied to payments, because we have a payment by results mechanism. So people will only get paid if we can see that they have genuinely delivered what they said they were going to deliver. And within that, we are factoring in, again, environmental sustainability, people's ability to have assessed and taken on board sustainable groundwater management and development practices. These are 2 programs that have only fairly recently been set up, but I think they offer us potentially a really good set of learning about how we can do this much more systematically across DFID. So that's with our 2 big programs. We also have a number of country programs, and I'm just going to talk about 3 of our country programs where we're specifically trying to build groundwater into the WASH programming. So in Sierra Leone, where DFID is one of the bigger WASH funders, we have 2 specific programs which are going on, which are trying to strengthen groundwater data availability in the country. And having worked in Sierra Leone a couple of decades ago, I can certainly attest to the need to actually have some decent groundwater data. I was talking with Alan earlier about an experience I had in the early 90s on a well digging program where we had one well where our hydrological assessment, our 3-hole drilling, had identified water at about 7 meters, which it had. Unfortunately, it was a perched aquifer. And I think we finally got down to a sustainable aquifer at 21 meters. Now, just pity the poor technicians who were at the bottom of that well continuing to dig a caisson column that was sinking down to 21 meters. It's a not insignificant challenge. So in Sierra Leone, there's quite a concerted approach to try and develop much better guidance around how we get more cost-effective boreholes to be drilled. So it's trying to develop a handbook. It's focusing on a practical course. about providing practical techniques for supervisors so they can supervise drilling projects. It is facilitating a public-private dialogue around drilling, which is important because in Sierra Leone, as in most countries, actually the drilling community is very much a private contractor community. There are fewer government-owned drilling rigs around the place. People are contracting in private providers, but in doing that you need to have controls, you have to have regulation, you need to make sure people are doing it correctly. And so some of the results we're seeing is that we're developing a cadre of professionals who have the kind of training that they need. Also within Sierra Leone, working with the African Development Bank, there's a rural WASH program which we are specifically trying to develop the development of wider groundwater maps and a groundwater monitoring system. And again, to develop national level guidance about effective water and sanitation facility development. In Tanzania, and this is a program that's much more of a water resource program rather than a WASH program, which is our support to the Rufiji River Basin Authority, which also includes some WASH results in it. Now, again, that has had a major technical assistance focus on hydrogeological monitoring and assessment. And here are some of the kind of details that we're looking at about, again, trying to make sure that there is a development of a clear conceptual model for groundwater systems in Rufiji, that there's put in place the infrastructure to map and to monitor that we're building the professional skills of water professionals to be more effective at groundwater management and monitoring. And perhaps most in particular is the fourth point, which is trying to be much clearer about how can you present data in a way that's helpful for program managers and for policymakers, because this is where the challenge really comes. How do you communicate what can be, as Geraint said, a very data-hungry discipline? How do you get that presented in a way that other people who are not as enthusiastic about data as hydrogeologists to have a look at and understand and take on board the key messages? And again, in the DRC, and this is quite impressive, because I think anybody will know places like DRC, they will appreciate the difficulty of operating in any way in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But again, through a Healthy Villages and Healthy Schools program, there's a use of a national hydrogeological map to try and look at the potential for groundwater development through manual drilling, looking at where mechanical drilling is going to be needed, making sure that geophysical testing is used, and making sure that multiple sites are identified where the potentials exist. And through a WASH consortium that we're supporting there, there's a much greater emphasis on trying to build up the effort and investment within hydrogeological investigations before water supplies are being developed. So using qualified hydrogeologists to do site investigations, making sure that those hydrogeologists have access to a range of techniques to help them do those assessments, and making sure that we get a hydrogeological site investigation report for each individual site. And that's really important, because actually the compilation of those individual site reports is ultimately what helps build up a much more comprehensive region-wide and later on national-wide picture of what works and what doesn't work. So that was a quick gallop through some of our WASH programs. I'm sorry, this is quite rapid because I'm trying to leave some time for discussion. Research, this is another major focus. And some of you may recognise this picture that came out of a paper from a piece of work that we commissioned probably now about 4 years ago, which was to try to pull together a continental-wide assessment of what the implications of climate change were going to be for groundwater resources in Africa, and therefore what are the policy implications that should flow, what do policy makers need to be aware about as they move forward with adaptation programs. I think one of the things that was really interesting about this program, and don't necessarily ask me about the detail, Alan McDonald's here, so you can hassle him about it. And if you disagree with what he did, definitely talk to Alan, don't talk to me. But one of the things that this really did was actually just trying to synthesize existing data. And that's actually important, because far too much of what we do in the development space always ends up by being primary studies, new study, let's get new data, let's have a new way of looking at this. the problem then is that actually none of that is brought together into a systematic overview about, well, this is the state of knowledge as we have it at the moment across the piece. Now, that's something we do much more effectively in developed countries than in developing countries. To be fair, it's something we do much more effectively in things like the health sector than we do in other sectors. But the point about this is whether or not you agree with the outputs of this paper is less the point. That actually what this is trying to do is to consolidate what we know now as a way of being able to direct future efforts in research and future focus of development in a more informed manner. What it also did was produce a number of different case studies, and I just pulled out one here, which I think was a particularly interesting finding, which is that for some of the admittedly anomalous but very high-yielding aquifers you find in parts of Africa, actually recharge is highly episodic. It might be decadal. Now, if you have that as your starting point, some of the more dire predictions you see about impacts of climate change on groundwater probably don't hold, at least for those particular aquifers. It may not be a continental-wide phenomenon, but at least for those particular aquifers, actually greater intensification of rainfall, provided it's falling into a basin that's quite sandy, it's quite flat, that you can have extensive flood areas and slow recharge into groundwater, actually is not necessarily that bad a thing. And what you're looking for are these really big, intense rainstorms that happen only very periodically. Okay. And that's led to a follow-up study, which was even more ambitious. So no one could accuse DFID of not being ambitious about trying to do these things, which was trying to look at the vulnerability of groundwater across the Indo-Gangetic plain to climate and pumping pressures. This is more challenging, not just because actually there's a lot more data in South Asia than there is across Africa, but you also run into the interesting negotiations with South Asian bureaucracies about gaining access to that data and then being able to share that data, which are not insignificant. And again, this will attempt to do the same thing as we did in Africa, which is to synthesize that information to give a state-of-the-art view of, well, this is what it looks like across the basin if you take all the available data now. And again, it will produce some interesting case studies, one of which is to look at the older aquifers in the arsenic-affected areas of the Bengal Basin. That's important, certainly for Bangladesh, because the deeper aquifers are probably the last strategic water resource the country has left. And if that's messed up, there really isn't anything else. I'm not sure what happens to Bangladesh after that. Looking at intensive pumping in the highly irrigated parts of the Gangetic Plain. Very specific one which is interesting, which is looking at groundwater use and storage in the Himalayan foothills. And in particular, they're trying to look at snowmelt glacier interactions with groundwater. And that's actually, I won't go into the reasons, that's locally very important. It potentially has a long-term strategic importance, which is allied around migratory movements as temperatures increase in the northern Indian plains, which Surat in the last couple of years has hit 55 degrees, and the only way is up, to be honest. So movement of people into the mountains is more likely. We need to understand the water ecosystems. And specifically, this is something that Stephen Foster, who's here, is active on, is looking at salinization across the Indus Plain, which is, again, a major threat to Pakistan's food security. Some of you in here will be aware of this, is the UpGrow program, which was the first of our specific water security programs. This is purely focused on groundwater. It's unlocking potential for groundwater for the poor. It is Africa focused. It was an argument that I lost. I tried to say that we should focus on South Asia and not Africa. But unfortunately, once you have a paper that gets 40,000 downloads, senior managers can tend to get very focused on the region where that particular study was done. But a very important program. It's a collaboration between DFID and the NERC. It's already gone through a set of catalytic grants. Various people in this room are involved with those. It's moving to its next stage of the full consortium awards. And again, this is a program that we would expect to yield a very significant body of data that will help improve groundwater management in Africa and really help inform future developments. I'm aware that I'm really running out of time, so I'm going to run through these last slides incredibly quickly. The first is, I'm sure all of you will have heard about the post-2015 framework, the replacement to the Millennium Development Goals. Where do WASH and water resources fit in it? Well, the high-level panel included a dedicated goal on water with targets for water resources and for WASH. The open working group has largely done the same. I think we're in a very good place at the moment. I think there's a really good reason to believe that that will be an outcome, and I think the importance of groundwater will find an importance through that mechanism, particularly because it'll be around sustainable and efficient use of resources and preservation of water quality. Some key things. Big plea to you, I think, as a groundwater community, is to engage with us in the donor community, engage with DFID, tell us about the things that we need to be doing more of, giving us advice, making sure we are aware of the latest tools and management approaches that we can and should be using. There's something called the UK Water Network. I would encourage people to engage with that. It's the way in which DFID has a systematic discussion with civil society organisations focused on water across the UK. So, conclusion, I think we do recognise the key importance of groundwater for WASH and wider water resources. Do we do enough of it? No, but then I have a groundwater background, so I would say that. I'm sure if you ask some of my senior managers, they would probably say yes. Some of them probably say too much. We recognise this as being important both in terms of WASH, but also in terms of our wider water resources and climate change work. We do need the community to be coming forward to help us in understanding the best ways of managing groundwater, making sure we remain on top of the latest developments. And a plea again, and people who know me will probably recognise why I always say this, is that a real win and a real trick here is making sure the link to climate change is fully understood, because that is where the political space for talking about water resources largely exists, certainly within DFID, but I suspect more broadly that's one of the key entry points. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, Guy. I think that's really nicely set the context for the day, and has obviously raised lots of interesting issues and questions. And we have just under 5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, for some questions from the floor. So if anybody has anything they would like to ask Guy, stick up your hand. And we have a microphone coming around, so if you can just wait for the microphone gets to you and give your name and organisation. Yes, please.
Stephen Foster, IH. Guy, a very inspiring talk in terms of going much more integrated in relation to the setting of WASH. You mentioned in relation to groundwater quality issues on large scale, and also in relation to, I think, though it didn't say it very specifically, the competition with irrigated agriculture and groundwater. I just wondered, looking back to the decades of past efforts in this area, whenever we tried to do that, we always encountered the argument that it was putting too much on the unit cost of provision. How are you getting around that problem, or how are you getting around the problem? Because I think that's an important sort of framing for future projects.
That's a very good question. And as usual, being a civil servant, I'm going to fudge the answer slightly. I think when we look at unit costs, and well, take one step back. The way DFID views value for money is not solely driven by unit costs. We place emphasis on value as well as the money bit. So we look at efficiency, we look at economy, and we look at effectiveness. So at one level, we factor in, we do look at unit costs, which are just the unit costs of development. And obviously, if you build in groundwater resource assessments, you need to reflect that. How we would address that is then talk about the value that comes from that. And that is a value that is linked around the greater likelihood of sustainability over the long term. So whenever you do your cost effectiveness analysis, one of the key things is your kind of discount period. I mean, how long are you going to spread this cost over? So I think the argument we would always articulate from the water community is that by investing in these resources now, what we do is greatly increase the likelihood of a sustainable water supply over the longer term, which extends the period over which we can do our value for money calculation. And so therefore, by a miraculous approach, still end up with quite a low unit cost. Some people don't like us doing that, but it's an ongoing argument, and it's kind of linked to the wider discussions we have around climate change, because a lot of the issues there is around investment to prevent adverse outcomes, and that is notoriously difficult to do. Real sort of hard econometric measures on, but it's an ongoing discussion that we have internally. Usual suspect.
Alan MacDonald from BGS. Guy, you've given a very good presentation of how DFID is trying to build groundwater expertise into its programs. I'm wondering if you could have any comments about some of the other major organisations and donors throughout the world. What's your impression of their direction of travel, of how seriously they're taking groundwater resources?
Okay. I ought to do a reality check. There's nobody else in any of these organisations. I think the picture is mixed. I mean, I think it would be true to say historically we would have looked to the World Bank to really be the leaders in this area. I think the World Bank still retains quite a lot of its groundwater expertise, but with some of the changes, some of their programs where they become less visible, I think there is a risk that groundwater also is going to become less visible. Now, I think we will need to look at how the World Bank genuinely integrates. If it does what it wants to do, which is integrating these issues across a wider set of investments, then I don't think we have to worry. But I would be slightly concerned that the GW mate function that used to be there has kind of got subsumed, and so it's less visible than it used to be. I think the Asian Development Bank has a very, very strong track record on water. Groundwater is a part of that. I think it would probably be true to say we'd like to see it to be stronger, but it is pretty good. And then the bilaterals fluctuate quite a bit, to be honest. The Japanese tend to be good, but often quite narrow. The Scandinavians are also quite good, but tend to be extremely broad, as are the Germans, and the Dutch are kind of somewhere in between. I mean, none of us, to be honest, let's face it, none of us get this completely right, and it would be wrong for me to say they don't. I think the UN does need to look at it more. I think some of the big providers on WASH programs need to invest more in their water resources, personnel, and get more water resources expertise in. I'm not convinced. UNICEF provides very good leadership on the service delivery side. I'm not convinced there's a comparable body that really effectively promotes the water resource side, including groundwater. I don't think UNEP does it particularly well. I don't think UNDP does it particularly well. The problem is that you have 23 UN agencies with some mandate over water, so it's a dysfunctional organisation. One of the things I think is very interesting is with the post-2015 framework, if we get a dedicated water goal, and we don't get a WASH goal, we get a water goal that has targets around WASH and water resources, that creates much more space to try and sort out the international architecture in a way that is much more functional, is much more supportive, and actually does tackle the water resources issues. And actually a really bad outcome would be ending up by having some of those targets scattered around other goals, because the coherency of a dedicated water goal, I think, gives you a kind of political space to operate that you don't get otherwise.
Okay, I think that's probably all we have time for just now. But could you just join me in thanking Guy again for speaking to us?
Thanks very much.